Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome from the APPG for MFL and our language show panel discussion this afternoon. And the title of the session is What Next for Languages Policy in the UK. My name is Tonya Antoniazzi. I'm the Member of Parliament for Gower. I'm a former head of modern foreign languages in the northwest of England and in South Wales. I have 20 years experience, so I know a lot about this subject, and it's really a true passion of mine to be promoting MFL, and I'm joined by my chair, and our chair is Baroness Garden of Frognall, who is also an MFL graduate and former teacher and former Department of Education government spokesperson. We are joined today by a number of fantastic panelists. But first, I'd just like to draw your attention to the chat box where we have some messages in there. If we really want this to be as interactive as possible, so please, if you can pop a message into the chat box telling us where you are, where you are in the UK or maybe in the world, what your interest in today's panel is and discussion, and also just great, as much interaction as we can have to keep this lively. And also, we're very, very keen, and the panelists are, to have your questions for the Q&A session afterwards, which we will be chairing. So from my perspective, it's best to get as much off your chest and ask all of those questions while you've got everybody here. So please do, but don't put them in the chat box. If you can, put them into the question and answer section. We would be able to pick them up from our respective parts of the country, where mine is a very gloomy Swansea, unfortunately. So, okay, without further ado, we have, from Education, we have David Blow, the Executive Head of South East Surrey Schools Education Trust. We have Emma Cayley, a chair from UCML, covering universities. We have Neil Kenny, who is a lead fellow for languages at the British Academy. We have Susanna Poulton from Society. Her role is as International Trade Advisor, which I think is a very key role that she has at the moment. We have Thomas Back, a reader in Human Cognitive Neuroscience from the University of Edinburgh. And we have Andrew Jack, a Global Education Editor from the Financial Times. So there will also be a little poll for you in the introduction. So keep an eye on your screens, because that's very, very important. But I'm just going to pass over now to Baroness Garden of Frognall.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Sue Garden. I speak for the Liberal Democrats in the Lords on education, and particularly post-16 education. And I, as Tonya says, I graduated in modern languages in French and Spanish from Oxford in the days when speaking the language was considered utterly irrelevant. What was really important was understanding the medieval texts. I was still fluent in French from a childhood spent in Paris. So I did speak the languages. And then with my RAF husband, we lived in Germany, and I got myself a school in a German gymnasium. So I picked up quite a bit of German along the way as well, but never quite as good as that. And so what I'm going to do is introduce you to the All-Party Parliamentary Group's National Recovery Programme for Languages. We'll go into more detail later on, but just to note at this stage that it came up with 5 strategic objectives for schools, for further and higher education, for business, for government, and for society. And what we try to do is identify what the issues were and how they could best be tackled. And I think we're all aware that there was a really alarming drop-off in modern languages when I think it was Gordon Brown decided it wasn't necessary for GCSE. And as soon as it became not necessary to do a modern language, lots and lots of people stopped studying them. But obviously, in today's world, it's more important than ever that we can communicate with all the countries around the world. And of course, when I was growing up, the only languages you could do at school tended to be French, German, and Spanish, sometimes Italian, but very seldom. Of course, Latin and Greek cropped up from time to time, but we weren't speaking those exactly. So any thoughts then of Arabic or Mandarin or the other myriad languages which are now available was not really considered a possibility. And so it's a very exciting world that we're in now with all these languages, but we do need somehow to encourage young people to realize just how exciting speaking other languages is. Right, and with that, I now hand back to Tonya.
Thank you very much, Sue. That's great. I mean, it is very important. I know myself from having been a teacher, and many of my friends are still in education, teaching languages, that it is more important now than ever to be speaking modern foreign languages and global languages to be able to communicate, particularly post-Brexit. So we, you know, we just want to look at our recovery plan and think to ourselves if these are still the right goals that we want. And we're going to look at what progress and changes have taken place so far in specific areas, and what should we be looking at in future language policy. Because so much has changed, we need to be making the focus putting the focus in the right place. So there are lots of areas that that can be raised in discussion, and our panelists will be covering a lot of these, particularly the impact of Brexit, COVID-19, and lots of other factors such as primary languages. Languages teaching was suspended at 1 in 5 primary schools in January 2021 due to COVID. And, what impact is that having, and how will that be built back in? All kind of questions that we need to be looking at and talking about. In secondary schools, which is where my expertise lies, we've got 2 in 5 pupils at Key Stage 3 not engaging with language learning during the first national lockdown. And we have to get these pupils back. We had a problem, and as Sue's already spoken about, when the government didn't drop languages, it tried to refocus and repurpose it. And fortunately, the consequences of that were unforeseen at the time, but they did have huge consequences. And I remember being in the classroom in the northwest of England when that happened. So exam entries in less taught languages in 2020 have fallen by 41% at A level, 28% for Polish at GCSE. These patterns are falling, and they are a huge concern to us. My 2 main languages are Italian and French, and as Sue has said, this is an issue for us moving forward, because we need to have more languages there and more languages available. So we're seeing a lot of international experience and a decline in international activities in primary and state secondary schools, such as partnering with schools abroad. I suppose we can also be positive and look at what COVID has brought us is ease of people using the internet. That was always a massive issue for us when we were setting up exchanges. Could we do it electronically? Well, to get the true experience, you have to be in the country, and that's very, very important. But we've got a number of concerns, particularly around teacher recruitment. It's been a late addition of MFL teachers into the shortage occupation list, but it's also more difficult for us to attract EU candidates for teacher training. So I'm going to move on, because I think it's really, really important. We have had successes working, and Neil Kenny can talk about that later, about developing language policy. And GCHQ have taken a lead role in coordinated language skills across the government. And we have, as I've just spoken about, we have addressed, the shortage occupation list. In fact, I have a friend from university that's currently in Sutton learning to be an MFL teacher, and to do that in your late 40s is quite a challenge, but she's absolutely up for the challenge, and that's brilliant. We've also had quite a lot of success in Wales with our government 5-year strategy, which is moving towards 1 million Welsh speakers, but then that does have an impact on the teaching of modern foreign languages. So we've got lots of questions that we can explore here about Brexit. Does Brexit make non-European languages more valuable? And what can we do to value, celebrate and learn from existing multilingualism that we do have in the UK? Again, I've spoken about the impact of digital and remote learning, and is there a new role for languages given the huge changes in society, and how can we put this into policy? And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So just going to move on with our first speaker is David Bowe, who is the Executive Head of the South East Surrey Schools Education Trust and advisor to ACSL. So over to you, David.
Lovely. Can I just check that you can hear me clearly?
Yes.
That's lovely. Thank you. Apologies. I'm having a slight technology crisis, but anyway, I'm doing it on the phone. So thank you for welcoming me to this. And I've worked closely with ASCL on data and also with the Association of Language Learning for many years. And I think in terms of policy, many of the things that you've been talking about, we've highlighted from a school perspective are driven by the fundamental issue of the severe grading of modern languages, which is a long-standing issue going right back to O-level, whereby students of similar ability are getting a grade lower in modern languages than they are in the other EBAC subjects. And with the accountability regime, that means that schools are disincentivized from offering it, and particularly from a pupil, they can see that the grades that they're getting in languages are lower than in other subjects, which means that they think that they're worse at it. It's nothing to do with that. As it goes right back to O-level days, it's simply a historical anomaly that Ofqual have accepted is an anomaly. But although they've made tiny changes, which actually got lost in the 2020 crisis, of not addressing the issue of bringing modern language grading into line with all the other EBAC subjects. Ofqual accidentally brought English and Maths into line in 2012, which was another long-standing anomaly, but they did make a move in 2012, albeit accidentally, to bring English and Maths into line. And we've pushed really hard to say that until that is addressed, it's not a panacea at all, but whilst that massive disadvantage is happening, there is continued pressure on schools not to be pushing languages hard. Therefore, if you're not going to do it at Key Stage 4, why then are you doing it at Key Stage 3? And you can see the corrosive effect that this is having. This would be such an easy policy change. It doesn't require any investment. It's literally the will from the centre to make that change. It could be changed overnight. And we've seen, even in 2020 and 21, how the gradings in subjects changed dramatically. Computing went up a whole grade, others went differently. So we're at a perfect opportunity urgently to revisit that grading issue. So that's the first challenge. The other massive threat to languages in school is arising from the latest proposals from the DFE around subject content, which, picking up on what was said a little bit earlier, is actually taking the clock back. It's sort of reducing languages to a puzzle rather than keeping communication at the centre of it. And it's been absolutely excellent that the all-party parliamentary group put out a statement that was supported by all of the major organisations, ASCL, NAHT, the Association of Language Learning, the Independent Schools Modern Language Association, the exam boards, and 1,000 teachers have all expressed their deep concern around these proposals. And even worse is the way that Ofsted have picked up on this very, very simplistic pedagogy and are now trying to change what's happening in schools without any remit to be doing that. And so it's really important that we push back on that. Otherwise, languages will be made even more challenging, less interesting, and the numbers will drop further. Somebody's talked around it. It's kind of the Latinization of language teaching. And you can just see what the consequence would be there for the motivation of children if it's just taught in this very dry and arid way. Language is about communication. I think, as you said, Tonya, you want to be able to communicate, you want to be in an authentic situation. All of that will disappear if these proposals go through. And even more worryingly, Ofsted are already out in schools trying to push this very negative pedagogy. So those, I think, are the two major threats, both of which can be very easily addressed from the centre at a policy level. And I think that's where this forum gives a great opportunity to be putting pressure back onto DFE and Ofqual to make those very simple decisions that would, well, in the first instance, remove a massive negative incentive and in the second, stop a change that is going to have very negative impact on language learning. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's excellent. I'm pleased if you've got any questions for David, just to remind you to put them in the question and answer box, not into the chat. So some very interesting comments in the chat box then about the difference between O-level and GCSE. And I was the first year of GCSE, I'll have you know, it was very difficult. So moving on then, we've got Emma Cayley next from UCML. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks so much, Tonya. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. And I think, you know, the importance of taking action in a sort of cohesive and collaborative way is one of the reasons why we're all here. And that's really important. I'm just going to explain who I am and what UCML is in case people out there are not familiar with it. So I wear a few different hats. I'm a professor of medieval French, so some of those medieval texts that Baroness Garden was mentioning earlier. I feel I've spent half my life trying to justify what I do in one way or another, either medieval literature or modern languages. I'm also head of School of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the University of Leeds. But I'm here in my capacity as chair of the University Council of Modern Languages, which is a post that I'm delighted to take up, and I've taken up quite recently. So just to describe a little bit what we do, we represent a number of member organisations, mainly university departments and schools of languages across the country. We have various functions. We monitor the health of the discipline, which is very important. We gather data for the sector. We've recently issued a few different reports, which you may or may not have seen, but I will attempt to multitask and drop them in the chat later. There's a joint report that we put out with the British Academy, which is the granularity report on admissions data for UCAS from 2012 to 2018, which was a report that came out in July, which was an attempt in some ways to dispel some of the gloom and doom stories about the demise of our disciplines. Obviously, we need to keep the pressure up, but I think the positivity is very important as well. And that sort of function of educating the media, if I may say, but also educating senior management in our own institutions about some of these things, and perhaps dispelling some of those more negative stories. We also issued a joint report with the Association of University Language Communities on the health of the sector. We aim to provide a unifying voice really across the sector, so that sense of collaboration again and engagement. Our association comprises representatives from the devolved nations, and we represent languages and linguistics. We have special interest groups as part of our association for early career academics in particular, and one which has been very active, as you can imagine, on the year abroad recently. In fact, I think they have a meeting this very afternoon of various departments and schools across the country on those issues, post-COVID and post-Brexit, which have come up. We collaborate with a number of partners, some of which people have mentioned already, the AULC, the ALL, some of whom may be here in the audience today, and recently a lot of collaboration with the British Academy, and Neil Kenny is here and he'll be talking a little bit later. Well, a very important function really is lobbying and advocacy on behalf of our members and other organisations, other languages organisations, and we provide on our website, which I'm not so good at multitasking, I'm going to do it right now, but I can drop the link to our website in the chat later, and that has a number of resources which hopefully will be useful for the sector. We also participate in some key strategic groups, one which has been set up reasonably recently together with the British Academy, which is the Strategic Committee for languages in higher education in the UK. We have a meeting again of that group soon, and more on that later, no doubt. I suppose in terms of priorities, I just want to flag the articulation of what we do, in particular the promotion of cultural study and degrees alongside language learning. I think is a really important issue, which perhaps isn't obvious enough, and we can do a little bit more in universities to help articulate that. The other thing which worries me, and I'm sure concerns many of you, is the issue of cold spots possibly opening up in provision across the UK in certain areas, in certain regions, but also within the provision of languages. So certain the issue for lesser taught languages in particular. I think the other thing I've touched on, the challenges that we have at the moment for residence abroad, for compulsory residence abroad, post-COVID, post-Brexit, the issue of mobility for staff and students, and visas, a lot of problems with visas. So there are a lot more things I could say, but I will stop there and let everyone else have a chance.
Thanks, Emma. Well, if anybody's got any questions for Emma, please put them into the Q&A. I think we've got 2 questions so far, and I'm sure there's plenty more. But Emma, somebody said you were at Exeter University lecturing. You must have missed. Go on.
I was there for 16 years. I only moved to Leeds in 2019, so I'm relatively new up in the north.
All right. Oh, that's brilliant. I'm an Exeter graduate, so that's interesting to know. I probably didn't impress you if you were there, but you're too young for that. Anyway, I shall move on. Right. Okay. So next we've got Neil Kenny, Lead Fellow for Languages at the British Academy. Neil, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. So just to introduce the British Academy for those who don't know it. So it's the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. So not part of government, but kind of the equivalent for humanities and social sciences of, say, the Royal Society for Sciences. So there are many priorities, and in this post-Brexit, post-2019 election world, we're seeking economic recovery. I think they can be pursued in ways that both chime with stated government priorities and are crucially above party politics, and so should be sustainable in the long term. Just a selection of such priorities in education: improving provision in primary schools, and in some parts of the UK still instigating it. Next, increasing uptake of languages so that it reaches the overwhelming majority of learners up to the age of 16 in the first instance. Increasing uptake post-16, not just in schools, but also in further education, which is too often overlooked in this context. And in higher education, Emma's just been talking about, where as is known, declining applications have caused provision to shrink. Another priority, better valuing, fostering, recognizing the learning of community or heritage languages and enabling them to be accredited. A priority more widely in society would be improving public awareness of the importance of learning languages and of multilingualism. But if I could just say why I think the policy climate, to be optimistic, is ripe, despite all the challenges, for pursuing these, because clearly progress on all these fronts is pure levelling up, if you want to use that phrase. It will spread the life chances provided by languages to disadvantaged groups, and, as we just heard from Emma, to some regions that currently benefit from them far less. Secondly, because progress on all these fronts is exactly building back better. It increases skills, productivity, competitiveness, and there are different research projects that have shown that. Thirdly, because progress on all these fronts makes the UK better able to engage globally in different settings, whether they're cultural, soft power, diplomacy, trade, and whether you call that aspiration Global Britain or some other name, it clearly contributes to that. Another reason to be optimistic is that in England, the New Schools Minister recently flagged up the importance of heritage or community languages, which was great. And finally, I'd say because the pandemic has given a wake-up call as to one of the many ways in which languages are an internal matter in the UK, as well as an external, out-facing matter, with that enormous amount of translating, interpreting, formal and also informal, that has played a really key role in the public health effort. And COVID has shown, just give one example of how tackling major societal changes is as much about communication as it is about science. So of that lot, this is just a selection, if I had to single out just one priority, if we're given an even more difficult task, I'd say it would be to increase uptake up to the age of 16. And so what should the target be then? What should the aspiration be? Well, I think the answer probably varies by jurisdiction because there are different contexts. For England, for example, where uptake, as we've kind of been hearing, was of course around 3/4 a couple of decades ago. It's currently just below 50%. The British Academy supports the Department for Education's aspiration of 90% uptake of a modern or ancient language by 2025. And looks like from the stats, though, a similar target would make sense for Northern Ireland, where current uptake rates are similar. Perhaps it wouldn't make sense for that aspiration to be so high in Scotland because the education system's different, fewer subjects are taken at National 5. For Wales, but I'll leave Tonya and other aspects really to comment with authority. Perhaps one could aim for 50% by 2030, 50% to study an international language, as it's called, as modern foreign languages are called in the Welsh system, to the age 16, so a language other than English or Welsh. And I think the rates are currently closer to 20%. So why single out that priority? Well, because although action is needed on many other fronts too, improvement in uptake up to the age of 16 is the one with the greatest power, not just to be a fantastic good in itself, core element of education, but because it would over time affect the most people. It affect most people in society. It would unlock some improvement in most of those other areas that I mentioned, ranging from post-16 uptake, to economic benefit, to public perceptions of language learning and so on. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm saying that action is needed on many fronts, but for me, that's the number one. To finish, I haven't here said anything about whether and how those priorities are being pursued at present, and whether we can improve on how we're going about it. I have much sympathy with the 2 points made by David Lowe, but I look forward to us getting down to such brass tacks in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Spot on, really, Neil. I mean, that's where I would put my priorities. But I thought I was just biased because without a language in your back pocket by the age of 16, you really are at a disadvantage or are less likely to want to pick it up and have the confidence to pick it up later on. And I think that is key because there are many university courses now. I'm currently looking with my son through what he can do, and that's a conversation. You can do that because you've got AS French. You can do that because you've got your GCSE French, and I think we have to have that can-do confidence to give our young people when they are looking at further and higher education. So that's why it's key. Pre-16. So you haven't come to listen to me, so we'll move on. This is the bit where we need to have the little bit of IT fun with a little poll. I'm going to hand over to Susanna Polton, our International Trade Advisor. Susanna.
Hello there, everybody. Yes, my name is Susanna Polton. I'm the International Trade Advisor for Life Sciences and Healthcare in Cambridge as part of the Department for International Trade. I'm not a civil servant, none of the trade advisors are. We are spread about all over the 9 English regions. And our role is to help to reduce any barriers to international trade that we possibly can and help the businesses from the teeny tiny ones, the ones coming out of universities or somebody in a shed who's just thought of something great, which happens, to growing them and then growing them even more, and then sending them off around the world with our wonderful colleagues that are in the British consulates and embassies all around the world. And there's so much to cover here. I think I'm just going to take a tiny little slice because I've got a bee in my bonnet really about the perennial question of which language do you choose? I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't matter which language you choose, just choose anyone, because the communication skills and the other skills that you have from that are really important. Before I go any further, I'd just like to do a quick poll to ask the audience, to find out who we have here and a little bit of what your experience is. So I've got 3 quick questions. Philip, can we launch the first question? Can you speak another language or languages to a very high level of fluency? I can't actually see that. I don't know, Philip, where the answer is for that. Can anyone see it?
Filling up. I'm going to close the poll in a moment.
Okay.
There we go. That's your answers at the moment.
Where?
Share results. There you go.
94%. Oh, I love speaking to linguists. Okay, so this is great. Second question, please.
Yeah.
Have you done business overseas? Trading internationally? Even for a company, doesn't have to be something you've started yourself.
Yeah, people are answering. If we give people maybe another 5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close it now.
38. Yeah, great. And final question, number 3. I tried to cram a lot in this question, so it might be a bit clunky. Of those who answered yes to 1 and 2, did you use your high-level acquired language for the business?
Yeah, people are answering. Give another 5 seconds. Okay, I'm ending now.
62. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. It gives me a good idea of who we have here this afternoon. When I quickly broach in the next 2 minutes, 2 parts that I really wanted to chat about, I'll get a better flavour of what you need to hear. So the first topic I'd like to talk about is Brexit, and what was my take on what I saw as a trade advisor in Cambridge. Life science and healthcare is predominantly an English-speaking sector worldwide, but not always the case. A lot of translation is done in websites. But I know of my colleagues that were helping companies that had to really deal with the paperwork. It was really misunderstandings in any language, English to English, English to French, English to Dutch, you name it, the paperwork through everybody. And so it wasn't just the actual nuts and bolts, can I get these widgets in this manner to this country? It was also, what is that number on that piece of paper? And what does the ending mean? And so it was a small language point, but a really, really important one. That was a barrier. And then secondly, the sort of how businesses moved about and made the new connections that they needed to using languages around the world and trading internationally. In my experience, all the companies that during the pandemic and during Brexit had been savvy networkers, and this includes a lot of linguists, savvy networkers who had a network all around the world of business partners or key stakeholders, they did much better than people who were maybe cut off, didn't know where to go or what to do. So my personal view was that the companies that thought ahead, if they didn't have the language facilities, they bought it in. They had the interpreters and they had the translators. If they already had people working from them, that was great in those languages. And I think that trend is a sign of a successful business. To recognize the qualities you have in your staff, and to recognize the reach that you have around the world, whether it's one-to-one on emails or whether it is how you have your shop front set up with a website and your international SEO. So there's such a broad amount that we do as international trade advisors. I think the final point really is which language, and secondly, can you pick up the phone and actually use your language in a useful, meaningful way? If there were some form of examination that would show us that somebody, can't read an entire book, but can get through to the right person on the phone or send an email that gets the correct response that the business needs, that's what we need to be measuring for business, something practical.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Susanna. That's excellent. So moving on, I'm glad the poll went well. That was quite smooth, so that was very useful. And now I'm going to go to Thomas Back, who's a reader in human cognitive neuroscience at the University of Edinburgh, and looks at the benefits of multilingualism. So I'll pass over to you, Thomas.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. So I have a rather unusual background, I think, for this round, because I was trained in medicine, and my main interest is the relationship between language and brain. I did my PhD on aphasia, on language disorders in different brain diseases. And over the last 10 years or so, I focused on the influence of multilingualism and language learning on cognitive functions, including, for instance, delaying the onset of dementia and improving the cognitive outcome after a stroke. So a very, very different perspective. And I have to say, listening to Susanna, I was kind of at some point almost afraid when she asked the question, which language should we learn? And I was incredibly relieved to hear any, because that is exactly what I would come from my point of view. For the brain, it doesn't matter whether you learn Mandarin or Gaelic, whether you learn Welsh or Polish or Punjabi and so on, the effects are very, very similar. I mean, the point is knowing a language at all. And I think that is one of the points that we really have to do. I think, of course, I mean, there's no question, and I think that was, very clearly made by Susanna, the point how important it is for business. But I think if we want to change, the uptake of languages, we need to change the whole attitude. We need to change really how people perceive languages, and that needs to go well beyond the kind of instrumental, well, learning Chinese might be quite good if you do business in China, to a positive attitude to languages at all. And I think that is fundamental. And here, all these arguments can come together, whether we come from the arguments from education or from business, or indeed from cognitive neurology. So, one of the things that we had, what are kind of simple things that we could do? Well, one thing that we unfortunately didn't do was the national census, in which I have been trying to convince the Office for National Statistics that speaking other languages than English is not a disease. Unfortunately, that's how they see it. You are only allowed to speak one language according to national census. And if that language is English, you are not allowed to mention any other languages. And if you speak any other language, you cannot speak more than one anyway. Then the only worry is, will you need maybe English translation for, medical or whatever purposes? So an attitude that basically the ideal is to have a society where everybody speaks only one language, English, everything else is considered really a burden. I think this sends exactly the wrong message to people around. If we value languages, we have to value all of them, whether they are indigenous, whether they are immigrant, or whether they are the big languages of business. And I think that is something which hopefully the work in cognitive neuroscience can help. I would say, I mean, just to kind of finish maybe with a comparison. I mean, if you want to make people more active physically, you are not just saying, you have to do swimming and nothing else. You are saying, well, pick up a sport, do something, it will be good for you. So we need to say that languages are not just about immediate instrumental advantages. They broaden our mind. They are fantastic language training. By the way, particularly in older people. I was impressed already in the dialogue. We had, I think, Angela, who said that with 51, she did the qualification is now teaching languages. That's fantastic. I think we really need to show that this is something for all generations. And here I would say even a transgenerational approach come to the benefit of school. I remember when I took my daughter, who was 7 at that time, to my Swahili class, and then she was very impressed afterwards and say, "Oh, Daddy, I see adults learn too." If the children see that parents are learning something, that they perceive it as valuable, then they think, oh, probably it is valuable, so maybe I should do it as well. So what we need is really to have a lot of different approaches, all converging on the idea of the value of learning and knowing languages.
That's excellent, Thomas. And there's some great comments now about what you've just been saying in the chat box, so which are definitely worth a look. I think that's an interesting reflection also, because I mean, when I started teaching, first of all, I used to teach a lot in evening classes, and there was always a mix of people wanting to learn Italian in the evening classes, and they were all there for different reasons, but all their motivations were to do something different. And I think when you're learning a language, that's really, really important. So our last speaker is Andrew Jack. He's the Global Education Editor at the Financial Times. So just to go over to Andrew now, and any questions, can I remind everybody to use the Q&A box? We have a few in there. You can also prioritize them if you think, oh, I really want that question asked. So please use that function as well. Okay, and there's lots of interesting links going into the chat box as well, but just handing over to Andrew Jack now. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Tonya. It's a pleasure to be here. Just by way of background, so I studied French, German and Russian at O-level, and to reflect on some of the previous comments, I dropped them at A-level because I felt they were already too focused on literature and not enough in my passion, which was about practical language and understanding and grammar and etymology and so on. But nonetheless, I went on to live in different countries, including France and Russia, and I remain a passionate believer in the importance of intercultural exchange and understanding, and also learning through emotion. So I resonate with Thomas's point about the danger of being too instrumentalist in language teaching. My other interests in this, I oversee the FT offers free access to senior level students and their teachers in schools around the world. So I'm very interested in sharing insights around the world from different cultures and language systems. I'm governor of a Russian-English bilingual primary school called Advocacy, and I'm also involved with a network called Europe 101, which is about trying to bring together young people in their 20s from around Europe to reflect on common visions of management and values and leadership going forwards. So I look forward very much to the discussion, but I think I think it's really important to consider the idea of rebalancing the nature of content and exam approaches, as we've seen within schools, to languages, but above all, really to think about removing the barriers to encourage wider exchange, whether it's of students on trips, whether it's the provision of teachers, teaching assistants, language students from other parts of Europe, for example, to come to the UK, and encouraging UK students of all ages is to spend a significant amount of time in other countries in Europe. And of course, Brexit has put huge barriers up to that. And finally, around bilingual education in particular, I think very big frustrations that we face in terms of lack of support or funding, and frankly, a very hostile regulatory and policy environment that makes it very difficult for community and bilingual schools to operate in general, and impossible pretty much within the state system. But would love to answer questions, and I'll just put up in the chat links to those organisations that I mentioned. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Right then, so Sue and I are going to be looking at the questions now, and we're going to take them, we're going to look, maybe at different areas: education, university, business, government, society. And I just wanted to, encourage people to put more questions in, if that's possible. And any thoughts? Because we've had very interesting speakers all coming at this from a different perspective, and very, very knowledgeable. So we've got
We have indeed. And in fact, the very first question that went up, I think David sort of answered it, which was the problem of the severe grading for languages, which is something we have raised endless times to the government and said, surely this is very simple. I worked for a long time for City and Guilds on vocational qualifications. And if we could see any particular qualification was either proving very, very difficult or very, very easy, we simply changed the goalpost. You simply adjusted it to make sure that there was an even playing field all around. And I can't understand why that hasn't happened. Emma mentioned the year abroad, and of course we were devastated at the lack of enthusiasm for Erasmus when we left the EU, because everybody said it was very good, and the government's brought in this sort of touring program, which seems to be something of a damp squid, but still it may prove to be brilliant. Neil from the British Academy, we've done a lot of work with the British Academy in languages. They've had some fantastic programs there. And you also mentioned heritage languages. And Andrew mentioned bilingualism, and it's extraordinary how people who speak another language at home don't reckon that they are sort of linguists, do they? So you've got people speaking Swahili, whatever it happens to be, fluently as well as English, but don't reckon that that counts. Susanna mentioned the language barriers to trade, and Thomas, the influence, that was fascinating. We had a fascinating all-party parliamentary group which proved definitively that learning a language stopped you getting Alzheimer's and kept your brain alive. We all came out feeling very much better from it. So thank you very much for your input, Thomas. That was good. And again, Andrew mentioning the importance of language rather than literature. Which I taught years ago. I taught CSE. Some of you may be old enough to remember CSE, but I remember what I really enjoyed about that was that in CSE you actually had to speak the language, whereas in O level, which was the more academic one, there really wasn't much requirement to speak at all. And I thought, this was a brilliant exam, but it got derided, as so often these exams do. So if we go to the questions in the Q&A, and let's see, what have we got here? Sorry, I'm going backwards, I think, because we've got on here about from Simon about languages in primary schools, and of course the government has said that that is due to happen, isn't it? So primary schools are supposed to teach a modern language. I don't know what you feel about that. I mean, obviously, the earlier you learn a foreign language, the better. I went to live in France when I was 8 and was totally fluent in French by the time I was 8.5, because you just absorb it. But I don't know whether the panelists have any views about languages in primary schools. You do need to be able then to follow it on into the secondary schools, don't you? And I think that's a bit of a difficulty. Have we got any views from the panel on that? No? Or
well,
I think you.
Yes, David.
I think what you've highlighted there is the absolutely key aspect of the whole tension nationally between the freedom that's been given to schools, whether through academisation, etc., against the efficiency and effectiveness of having a single language that is begun and then followed through. When you have lots and lots of different primary schools feeding into a secondary school, if they've done different languages, it just makes it extremely difficult to be able to build effectively on what's gone previously. And I think there's a fundamental political issue there around choice and freedom being given to schools, and what one might see as an overall need or direction. And I think that there's this kind of reality there around the political imperatives around choice and freedom.
Yes, I know. I was working with the Japanese at one stage when all that came out, and they were terribly enthusiastic about this and produced some brilliant materials for primary school to try and encourage primary schools to learn Japanese. But that's a bit of a minority choice, I think. Andrew, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I mean, just on the issue of primary schools, I think absolutely fundamental. You know, one of the things that we see, for example, in our bilingual school is that even parents from families from other cultures and countries feel they have to focus only on English, which of course is against all of the evidence about how you should actually build on the roots and the languages that you're strongest with, and that will help you both in mastery of English and indeed in other languages going forwards. But unfortunately, all sorts of issues, including, you know, so-called British values and so on in official inspections, and the lack of language ability often by inspectors, makes it very difficult to operate in that environment. And as you'll probably know, there are some interesting initiatives like one called Wallow that started quite recently, which is trying to, you know, not simply take language learning in the early years as an academic subject, but very much use it as a way to embrace the culture and language backgrounds of children that we have from such diverse linguistic communities and backgrounds in so many of our schools. And that should be the basis on which to build, to be proud of, to reference your own background, to talk about the richness of difference in expressions and phrases and ideas. And that has to be good for all children, monolingual or bilingual.
And of course, little children aren't embarrassed, are they, at making funny noises? You know, if you don't introduce a foreign language until children are 11, they're going through the stage where they're sort of embarrassed to make strange noises. Whereas little 5- and 6-year-olds, you know, they don't worry a bit about that. Neil, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. Just to really echo what's been said about primary. Again, the situation does vary a lot, doesn't it, depending on the jurisdiction. That in England, there is this national curriculum remit to make substantial progress in the language at Key Stage 2. In Wales, I gather, the new curriculum will introduce languages, international languages at primary from year 5. In Scotland, actually by age 8, kids are already being taught a second language, exposed to a second language at primary. So very, and at Northern Ireland, there's relatively little primary language learning. But I think for England, there is a disconnect at the moment between what's in the national curriculum and what's happening on the ground, where there's fantastic practice in some schools, absolutely fantastic, but it's a very, very patchy, uneven picture. And as I say, really not hitting that target. So, and interesting work's been done by Ripple, the primary school networks and others, to think about how to bridge that gap and implement better. But I think it doesn't seem to be a current priority for the Department for Education. They're really, you know, for other very strong reasons, trying to focus on increasing uptake at GCSE. But I think a really hard look will need to be taken at it for England without prejudging in which direction things go, because one possible direction would be the sort of thing that Andrew is talking about actually focusing more on language awareness, on thinking about language, on using the resources brought to the classroom by many multilingual learners already, both for their sake and for others' sake. Another is to really put more eggs in the basket of substantial progress in one language. There are different options, but I think a really good look will need to be taken at it. Thanks.
Yes, we've got Glynis Romley has come in saying, why isn't it norma referenced? Sorry, why isn't it criterion referenced rather than norm referenced, so that you could understand your gradings better from that? And I think there's a lot to be said about that, really, because it certainly used to be the case when I was teaching that you tried to get students to do the December resit, because that way there would be weaker candidates going in, so they've got more chance of passing. So I don't know quite why we don't do that. Right, any more comments from any of our speakers on this? Or Tonya, do you want to come in at this stage?
I did have my hand up briefly. Is that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you mind if I come up?
Yes, of course.
Do you mind if I come in?
I lost you from my screen. It's the wonders of Zoom, isn't it? Yes. Okay. No,
I was just really going to add to the things that everyone else has said, and just to say that you know, from a university's point of view, there's obviously quite a lot that we can do, universities and other providers, in terms of teacher training, because obviously that is another of the issues here, because it is a food chain, and we all have to, you know, every link has to join with the previous one, you know, and I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of helping with outreach as well, particularly for disadvantaged schools and areas. And I was just going to mention an initiative which some people here may have heard of, which is Roots into Languages, which was originally funded by HEFCE and now has come under the protection or the guardianship, in a way, of my organisation of UCML, which you know is kind of, I suppose, trying to provide that UK-wide coverage and help with outreach, as I say, to less advantaged areas and schools. So that was just the comment that I wanted to add there.
Yes, indeed. Yes, and Thomas, you've got your hand up. What would you like to say?
A quick comment, I mean, about the age. I would say every age has certain important points. So I think the fact that children are exposed to languages, if it's not very intense early, will probably not make them learn the languages if the exposure is low that much. But it has been shown, I think, by research, for instance, from Florence Miles, that they will then retain a more positive attitude to language throughout their life. So exactly the point that you made, that, you know, for a small child, it's kind of relatively nice. We are making different sounds and so on and so on. So once they overcome, so to say, this hesitation, they will have it much easier later on. And then the second point is, I think it's important from the point of view of the brain, of course, that we continue practicing all the time. That's why it's important. I mean, I always say there's a metaphor from sport. I mean, let's say if you start learning tennis with 50, you will probably not win Wimbledon. I'm afraid that's gone. But let's say if you start playing tennis with 50 and you do it regularly, you are probably better on with 75 than someone who won Wimbledon in 25 and then spent 50 years doing absolutely nothing in terms of exercise. So I think it's language practice should be seen as something which needs to be continuous, which should be basically become a habit.
Indeed. And David, you've got your hand up.
It's really just following on from some of those points that when Ashcombe became a language college back in 1998, insisted that 20% of the money went out to the local primary schools and used that to fund particularly language experience, and that sense of just learning to enjoy learning bits of different languages, whether it was Mandarin, which particularly at that time was innovative. And we introduced a thing called the Big Sing, where each of the primary schools came together into the school just to sing a song in a different language, whether it's French, German, Spanish, Italian, but that whole sense of engagement and fun, and not getting too hung up about making measurable progress in any one language. So that the idea was then that as they moved through and onwards, whenever the main language was going to be chosen, they got a positive attitude towards language learning, and you'd done that whole cultural bit around an awareness of other cultures across the world. The language is important in terms of just communicating with people, whether it's through song, music, images, just all of that. So particularly using the primary school and then their enthusiasm, rather than say trying to get into the straitjacket of making measurable progress in one language, which if it isn't followed through at secondary, all just starts to trip itself up. And I think that is a fundamental dilemma in England at the moment, where you haven't got an obligatory curriculum. To some extent, you're onto a real struggle if you're trying to tie things in. And whereas in other jurisdictions where there is a more obligatory curriculum, then you can have that degree of progression.
Yes, and you mentioned fun. I've always thought it was so important that all education and learning should be fun. you know, because you learn so much better if you're enjoying it, don't you?
Yeah.
And particularly with languages, it ought to be possible to do that. I have to say there was one of the British Academy programs I was involved with where there were schools who were producing all sorts of interesting programs where, you know, they introduced food of the language and things like that, and cinema. And there are all these different aspects which got the children really, really engaged in the country to learn more about the country.
And I think that's why we're so fundamentally opposed to the new proposals from the DFE and Ofsted, because they are taking the fun out, they're removing the authentic languages, and it's just moving it all back to very dry, the kind of language learning that you were talking about, and it's so damaging, and it's been just driven by just one or two people, and it's so important that everybody continues to come together to push back at this and to say it's not right. You know, everything at the moment isn't perfect, but for goodness sake, don't go back like that.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that employers prefer to have somebody who has a foreign language and has an international perspective, isn't there? Susanna, could you say something more about the trade envoys and the work there? Are you're all expected to be linguists for your trade?
So the trade advisors in this country, for the most part, the number one skill that we have is that we've done a lot of business around the world, and that tends to draw in people who either learn languages at a later date or have had some language. You know, you can use it for all sorts of different levels of language. You don't have to be a great negotiator in a language. It could be useful for that company if you know, have an icebreaker. It could be that level of language. So I think it's, for us as trade advisors, it's really important that we look at all aspects. And one thing which I haven't seen so far on the comments, and I'm a bit, you know, so we've done the poll, we know who's here, we're all linguists. I want to talk, I just want to mention Google Translate. Because, you know, when I first started doing this about 8 years ago, that was an anathema to me. Now I find it's improved to the point where somebody who is starting their own business and can't afford a translation, or to employ staff who have that native capacity or high fluency level, they are using it, and they're using it really effectively, and it's getting better and better. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix. It doesn't matter, even if your language is low, there are ways of using language. If you are confident in saying, okay, I can answer this, and the person I'm supposed to be emailing with a bit of Google Translate on my side. I just wanted to gather people's opinions from the panel and the audience on that.
Right. Tonya, over to you. Any particular questions you picked up in the chat or the Q&A?
Well, I think it'd be quite interesting to explore and continue to explore the comments made there by Susanna about Google Translate. I mean, I know that, you know, if we can give people people can have the confidence to give it a go, that goes, you know, it's worth so much. And it's given them the tools to use it and wanting to use it. But I could see Susanna's still got her hand up. I don't know whether that's legacy. And Neil's got his hand up. So, oh, and David. Because, David, I mean, when I was teaching and Google Translate was around, you had to teach the skills to use Google Translate to the pupils. But, you know, I haven't tried it recently. So, you know, maybe I should give it a little bit of a dry run. Okay, then. Well, I'll go over to Neil first then, and then we'll go to David, and then, oh, everybody's got their hand up. We'll just go around the table then.
Thanks very much. Just this is a multi-layered, fascinating discussion. I'm going to say something about Google Translate, but just to finish on the primary thing, another factor in addition to David's point about freedom of choice in schools that makes the transition really difficult is the fact that it's an English-dominated society. So that's really different. So there's no other single language that is really obvious should be the priority in the way there is for other countries where it's English that should be the priority. So that means that we Anglophone countries, Anglophone-dominated countries, have a particular challenge. And I totally agree that any primary needs to start with transition, needs to start with making that transition coherent. Just on Google Translate, I think there's a danger, isn't there, that it cuts both ways. That I've heard people say, well, I don't need to learn languages anymore because of Google Translate and machine learning. So I think we need to know, is there a good answer to that, genuinely? And I think there really is, which is that we've already heard some just now from how it can be used by people who have some of a language as a kind of prosthesis, if you like, but also it really reinforces the importance of that intercultural understanding that you get through language learning and the other skills you get through language learning that change your brain, as Thomas says, because Google Translate will not give you any of those. It will just give you decoding something in other terms. And then if you look, sorry, this is really possibly moving on the discussion a bit too far and fast, but if you really look at the latest World Economic Forum's top 10 skills that have been published recently, many of them are exactly the sort of thing that you get from language learning, particularly if it gets quite culturally immersive, the sort of thing that Emma talked about at the start for degree level, that's really important. But even right from the start, right from primary school, and certainly at GCSE, there's, just to list some of them, there's analytical thinking and innovation, complex problem solving, critical thinking analysis, creativity, communication, and so on. Resilience, which is something that employers tell us at university level they really like about modern language graduates because they've adapted to other cultures, lived abroad, in the year abroad, etc. So I'd just like to suggest that that's the way to answer that, to look at everything that language learning gives you, as well as the ability to know exactly what that word means in another language. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, Neil, because also, I mean, David was talking about primary languages. There's nothing more magic of getting real positivity when you have open evenings in secondary schools of children really desperate to know what languages they can learn and what experiences they're going to have at secondary school. And, from when I taught in a language college as well in the northwest of England to even in my final years in Wales, it was they wanted to know, was it just French or could they do Spanish, could they do Italian and even German? And that enthusiasm comes through from the primary schools and from the experiences that they have there. David, you had your hand up next, and then I'll go over to Andrew.
Yes, I mean, I've seen some of the comments from teachers, and as somebody who's still teaching French, that there's a real question as to how do you handle things like Google Translate? And a couple of things I'd just like to give as points of comparison was to think back to when calculators were coming into schools and the massive arguments and debates as to should you be allowed to use a calculator or not, and so on. Should you be allowed to use Google Translate? And indeed, I'd also highlight DeepL and Lingui as two other really good translation sources. And I think, in a sense, within schools, we need to almost perhaps learn how to, and when and if it's to show the students how to use Google Translate. It's almost like back in maths days, there's no point just setting some sums. If the student's got a calculator at home, they can just do the sums using the calculator. So schools have got to recognise and embrace the fact that Google Translate, DeepL, Lingui are all out there. But I'd also perhaps pick up on Neil's point. The other analogy I've used is it's a bit like a sat-nav. It can do things, but also if you're driving along just looking at the sat-nav, you're unaware of the countryside around. You're unaware of almost where you are and how you've got there. And also, as we know, sat-nav can take you down country lanes and leave you stuck, just like the equivalent of Google Translate can leave you in not a clever position. It's a tool. Unlike any tool, you can either use it well or you can use it to cut yourself. And I think we just recognise that it's there and just need to think hard around how, when, and what is it appropriate for. I'm glad I made someone laugh. That was it. Okay, fine.
No, that's great, David. It's true, it is a tool and we just need to use it correctly, but it is a pain. Yeah, okay, I'll go over to Andrew. I know Thomas did have his hand up as well, but I'll go to Andrew.
No, just very briefly, I totally agree with what David was saying. I mean, there's no doubt Google and of these other technological tools have made amazing progress in technical translation. And I think, for example, for transactional arrangements, a company that's trying to discuss with a counterpart in another language or whatever, it's very powerful, and we shouldn't kind of try to hide away from it. But I think this goes back to the fundamental point that we shouldn't just be thinking about pure academic language learning in schools or universities. We should be thinking about language and culture together. And of course, if we're talking about the use of language, as David and others were saying, I mean, it's about developing relationships. It's about understanding the context of the country and the culture that you're working with. It's about the wider hinterland. So yes, it's got a great important role to play, but we shouldn't just think about tweaking the exam system to kind of somehow compensate or get around the use of Google. We should be thinking about the next generation and how we immerse them fully in an ongoing way with languages and cultures more generally.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks, Andrew. And over to Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, just to join. So one point is, of course, that, as it was said, Google, all those tools are great if you know how to use them. They don't, I think it is great if we can use them as a complement to complement language teaching rather than to replace it. I think that's very important. And, I'm collecting all this kind of funny Google mistakes, which are based on the fact that you translate things literally and so on and so on. I don't think this is really necessarily a guarantee. If you know a language, then you can use it. If not, then it can be quite problematic. And the second point, of course, in terms of the kind of cognitive benefits of language learning, of course, you will not get it from using Google. So I say always, of course, you can drive to work or you can walk there. You might be a bit faster driving, but you will be healthier going there. So from this point of view, I think, as I say, I'm very much in favor of all these technological things if they are seen as additional tools rather than as replacement.
There's a
Thank
question,
you, Thomas.
there's a
Go on,
question
sorry,
in
Sue.
the chat from Ramona. Why is it so hard for the APPG to change the government policy on foreign languages in schools? How can universities help practically to support this? And I think that is, it is difficult for us for some reason to, we have quite a lot of clout with the government, but we don't necessarily manage to change the policy. Any ideas of how the universities might be able to help us in our influence with the government? Because the government does listen to universities occasionally. Any suggestions for how we could be more effective in that? Or is that back to the APPG to try and work more positively? No particular thoughts on that one.
Emma's got a hand up, Sue.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't have a magic wand on this one, but I think maybe it's that it's just that thing of articulating better what the benefits are and what we need, and perhaps talking in fora like this rather than sort of talking amongst ourselves, making sure that we're in all the right kind of conversations, and that universities are in touch with what's going on the ground in schools. So I've, for one, have found this discussion really, really important and valuable, just to get a sort of a better idea of what is going on. If there's anything that UCML can do to help, Baroness Garden, we'd be very delighted to do that and to work in partnership.
Well, in the National Recovery Programme, of course, we wanted universities to protect and expand language courses in college and universities, and introduce language accreditation into the apprenticeship programme, which I suppose is another aspect of this. But it has been quite disconcerting to see universities who have closed their language departments, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But there are one or two of them who are insisting on a language for their new undergraduates, aren't there? I think Aston was one where, if you didn't have a GCSE in a language, when you turned up in your first year, you were encouraged to join a language class and to pick up a language in your first year. And that seemed to be a fairly enterprising way of looking at it, really. Susanna, you've got your hand up, yes.
Hi, yes. I just wanted to check on that subject. If anyone remembers the project that came out of, I wonder if it was from APPG originally, and it was suggested in, I think, in the House of Lords. Anyway, whatever happened is it came down to the Department for International Trade, and 11 language and culture advisors were employed, and I was one of those. And our role was not just to do sort of try to help businesses to understand how they can internationalize their websites and how they can communicate across cultures and across languages, but it was also to connect with the universities to try and help postgrad university students find roles within companies in order to use the languages that we have here from the students in this country. And it was a really good idea, but it didn't work because it was almost like a one-man band recruitment agency trying to match the postgrads with the companies. It was very, very hard. So implementation wasn't possible. The idea was good, and I wonder if we could think not along those lines, but on how universities can have better connections with businesses in their local area. In East Anglia, we have 11. To keep those ties and communications going between the businesses who actually need this as a functionality in their businesses in order to increase export sales, and university students who might not be taking a language degree but have that language facility.
Yes, yes. Because we were encouraged at the Foreign Office. I think it was William Hague who was horrified to discover that most of the people working in the Foreign Office did not speak another language, and set up, and there's a fantastic language sort of laboratory in the bottom of the Foreign Office, where everybody working there is encouraged to go and learn at least one other language. And the military also set up, because they had a fantastic language school at Beaconsfield, mainly for spies, obviously, but and they, when that closed down, they set up a tremendous foreign language facility at Shrivenham, at the Staff College at Shrivenham, which again, with a whole range of different languages, so that military people could go and learn a language. So, you know, that there are some efforts by different government departments, I think, to try and make sure that we've got language provision. But it doesn't necessarily add up to a complete picture, does it? Neil, you're coming back on that.
If I may come back on various points, the interesting suggestion about universities stipulating GCSE in language as an entrance requirement, I think has real access problems. That's the widening participation problems. That's, you know, at a time that in England fewer than 50% will have that. Although it's, I quite agree, it is interesting to pursue the softer option of strong encouragement to those that don't. I think universities, the higher education sector and the secondary education sector have been speaking to each other, often through the APPG, with the APPG, much more in recent years. And I'd like to think that may have had the odd sort of minor beneficial impact already, in terms of, for example, around the minor tweaks that have been made to severe grading already that David mentioned, that the higher education sector made its feelings very clear. And I trust that it would continue to do so with further efforts to address that problem at proper scale. And actually, towards a national languages strategy that Emma put earlier, the link to in the chat kindly, that was published in July 2021, was a collaboration between, you know, British Academy and Universities UK and the Association of School and College Leaders, ASCL, and others around many language issues. I think that the universities are closing departments because of the pipeline. Essentially, that's the bottom line, because it's a market model of funding at higher education, so that it's how many punters you have queuing up to come into the door. And when that dries up, then it's very difficult for university managers to to sustain the provision. And finally, another outcome towards a national languages strategy will be a web portal that should be launched by about Easter next year, be called something like Languages UK. And one of its functions will be to try and be a one-stop shop for languages. You go and it will funnel you to all the amazing organizations, resources represented in the participants today and audience that are out there. But it also might eventually serve as a nice point of connection to enable more connect up between universities, businesses, universities, further education colleges, perhaps mainstream schools, their local supplementary schools and so on, if that website really gets legs. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Tonya, you're coming back in?
Yeah, so I put my hand up there because there's a question from Vivian Heenan in the chat box at 3:08, talking about training at Polytechnic, having studied French, German and Spanish with secretarial skills for 2 years, fluent enough to go and work in central France. And just going down that question, it's important not only to learn, the language, but to speak it. This is what we've been talking about. Knowing the practical vocabulary necessary in the workplace. And she went on to work in an export department and became an export sales manager. Now, when Neil is talking about getting the punters into the universities in order for them to have those places available, why, whose responsibility is it? And I think are the universities not adapting, not making themselves fit for purpose, fit for the post-Brexit, post-COVID world that we're living in, and taking the easy financial option and checking out? Or how can we encourage them from the APPG to look further and adapt? Is it that simple? That's my question really to you guys, but I know that David did have his hand up before me, and we really do need to be bringing back evening classes for languages, and we need to be teaching practical languages in university to go alongside the skills that we have. So I know it is there in a lot of courses, but also what can we do? Should we go to David?
Yes, we go to David then. Yes. David, you're on mute still.
Sorry, it's all a bit challenging on my phone.
Yes.
I'd really like publicly to thank Neil and his other colleagues in higher education, because it has been absolutely critical that state schools, the independent schools and higher education and the head teacher organisations and so on have all been working really closely together over the last 10, 15 years. There were changes made to the A-star grading at A-level and to the A grading, and that really, to be honest, only happened because we were unified, we were focused on it. We have made a little bit of progress on the GCSE, but unfortunately it's just hit a sort of political brick wall, and it's been absolutely critical. And thank you to the APPG for getting their statement up about the subject content, because getting all the universities to sign that statement, all of the organisations, has sent an incredibly strong message to the DfE. It's having some impact, but I'm deeply worried that there may still be that push through of, the minister or the advisor just saying, well, we're going to go ahead with it, and we're going to ignore this massive concern that's been expressed by so many people. But I just really, again, thank Neil and his colleagues for the working together, which has been so important to try and help everybody.
Yes, I think that we haven't really touched on the impact of COVID, but I think that did have quite an impact on teaching generally, didn't it? But it seemed to have hit modern language teaching as well pretty badly. Neil, I think, were you not involved with the GCHQ talk? They were talking about coordinating modern languages, were they not? And produced a report on it?
Thanks. I'm not directly involved, but I just would like to put on record that it's a really welcome development that GCHQ is its directorate, I think the senior responsible officer for languages, which gives GCHQ now in government, which gives GCHQ an important role, and they have a new head of language engagement who's being very proactive and dynamic and reaching out to languages stakeholders. And I think one of the purposes of that new direction in GCHQ is to create links, really, and to help build a stronger sense of community in the way we've just been discussing between HE and secondary, but more widely still beyond education skills, for example. And obviously not obviously, but the other strand of that work, as I understand it, is supporting building out the cross-Whitehall languages group and really ensuring that what language skills there are in the civil service are known and deployed well, and there's good coordination and discussion there at that level. But I think where it's important to realize that while extremely welcome and helpful, is not the same as a policy development forum. So it's not the situation, that I understand it, that there is now a space in government cross-departmentally to develop language policy, which, as we know, affects not just the Department for Education, but many government departments in terms of its ramifications. We've heard about that from Susanna and others. So there is still, for example, the HRC had a project called ARI, which issued a call for a chief government linguist to be mooted at some point on the model of the medical and science advisors. Wouldn't it be great if there was someone who was a bit more tasked with policy development to explore the implications of language policy across government departments? But I think we're not there at this point. But this greater involvement and role taken by GCSE is certainly extremely welcome.
Yes. Because of course it isn't just the Foreign Office and Defence who need languages, is it? I mean, culture, media, and sport should have a language component too, and all the various other. And certainly the Home Office needs to have different languages to cope with all the different people from different countries that it has to deal with. And we're short of that. I see that Emma has put a toolkit into the Q&A box for senior management in universities, persuade them of the benefits of languages and culture. And
yeah, that was just in response to your point earlier about what universities can do to spread the word about language learning. It's a toolkit that we put together, that my organisation put together on the back of a workshop about surviving and thriving in a difficult climate for languages, and it's really just a series of recommendations to colleagues of how they can how they can, I suppose, as I say, spread the word about languages, the kind of persuasion techniques that can be employed, and the ways that they can move into positions which give them, allow them the possibility to discuss some of these things with senior management. So that's really what I was going to flag. And I did also, Neil mentioned the ARI projects. I put a link in the chat to the ARI projects, and it looks like we've got Wendy Bennett with us at least, who's leading one of those projects.
Oh, good, yes. We've got about another 10 minutes, I think. So if there are other comments or questions, please do come up with them now.
Shall we just use what remaining time we've got to have some final comments from each one of our panelists.
I think that's an excellent idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. I won't finish yet, but just to call upon each one of our panelists to, you know, just to wrap up and talk about emerging themes and have a final few words. We'd really appreciate it. So I'll go in the order that I did earlier, and I'll go to David first.
I've really enjoyed being here this afternoon, and it's been lovely to meet up with people and to get reinforced with the importance of learning languages. And I suppose, in a sense, if I must say, having yourself and Baroness representing both parts of the House of Parliament, it's then how do we translate some of the lovely thinking here into policy, actual practice, and I think having the APPG has been absolutely invaluable as a very high profile, influential, cross-party organisation. And then thank you for your support, and look forward to working with you and all the other colleagues in higher education and more widely. This working together is critical. It's kind of when you're under threat, when you've got challenges, that's when you find out who your real friends are. And you know, that's been lovely to have this afternoon as a sense to reaffirm ourselves and to gird our loins for the onward struggles, I suppose.
Thank you. We perhaps ought to give some credit to Jean Cousins, who's a crossbench peer who works phenomenally hard for this, because peers aren't allowed to chair all party parliamentary groups. The Commons say they're elected, so they have to chair them. But Jean is an incredibly powerful ambassador for modern languages and never loses any minutes, you know, to make the points, doesn't she, Tonya? Yes, we know only too well. Yes.
No, definitely. And I just like to say thank you to David for still being in the classroom. I miss it, but keep going. And like I say, we'll keep working with you to make the change happen. So just passing on now to Emma Cayley. Emma.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I don't think I can say it any better than David, really, but just in the opposite direction, I suppose it's wonderful to work with all of you. And I think that that sort of cohesive and collaborative action is what's needed, and you know, just looking forward to doing more of that in the future. And I think just in terms of challenges for university departments and schools of languages, and actually Tonya, I think it was you who sort of, you know, put this out as a challenge, really. It's you know, it's behoves all of us, I suppose, in departments and schools of languages to think really seriously about the long-term sustainability of our disciplines and how we achieve that, and you know, articulating it better, articulating to senior management what the benefits of having a gold standard languages department or school would be beyond the purely financial and sort of market driven logic. So yeah, better articulating coordination across the sector and working together and seeing the bigger picture. You know, that it's not just about our small fields. You know, it's not just about individual languages or individual areas. It's about the you know, the broader landscape for languages. You know, and what's good for the health of our disciplines more broadly. So just a kind of plea, really, to not so much to this audience, but to people in higher education in languages to sort of avoid that tunnel vision that can sometimes occur of thinking about a single area. You know, and as I said at the beginning, thinking a little bit more about how we explain what we do, you know, beyond the university. So, you know, what are the benefits of a languages degree? What is there apart from the actual language learning that's important and valuable for society? You know, and also, as I said a little bit earlier, the importance of action from universities in terms of outreach, roots into language, which I mentioned. Roots into Languages work with less advantaged areas and schools, drawing in community languages, thinking about heritage languages as well, and you know, valuing the multilingual backgrounds university staff and students, and sort of making sure that the global in global university, which is quite frequently a part of the rhetoric of university strategy, isn't just an empty global, but one that actually engages with multilingualism at home and abroad, and that we emphasize the societal impact that the study of languages has, both in our communities and further afield. So sorry, I've gone on far too long, but I will stop there.
I'd like to thank you as well, because I worked extensively with Roots into Languages, and just to say thank you for the outreach work, because I know that teachers on the ground really appreciate it, and it means so much to motivate and support their pupils in carrying on with languages. So thank you for having the vision as well to carry on that good work. So thank you, Emma. And then moving on to Neil, who I always find absolutely fascinating. Neil, over to you for a few minutes.
Thanks. Just two points, if I may. One is to go back to the probably imminent announcement from the Department for Education about what its plans are for a new reformed GCSE. I think this is really important for the future of the subject. It's a critical moment, you could say, and everyone's waiting with bated breath. And just to reiterate, well, first of all, that there's much to be embraced here. I think the facts, although it is very difficult for teachers to think about yet more reform, yet more change, undoubtedly, but the fact of reform that the British Academy certainly thinks is welcome, to make a qualification that is genuinely for all, within the reach of all, that has sequenced progress, is engaging and enjoyable, but more than minor tweaks to the existing proposals are needed to make it achieve those ends. It's a very widespread feeling in higher education, very strongly, as well as at secondary education. So really to express the hope that there will be a pause to effect some substantive changes to what's proposed, without jettisoning it completely, but some substantive changes that to ensure that it is a success in partnership with the Department for Education. Second point is my attempt to, following Emma, to respond to Tonya's challenge to universities, which is a great one. I think that's really important, and say back to you, what is needed is some sort of way of incentivizing universities to do the investment that is required to make major changes, major reorientations of different kinds of languages and that kind of thing. I mean, I think much of what is offered is already fantastic, but you're right that there could be more university adjustment to cater to the new world. But currently, in the market model of funding, it needs some sort of injection in order to incentivize that reprioritization. And so, and perhaps the APPG could do some work with the new committee that Emma mentioned, Strategic Committee for Languages in Higher Education. There's a joint new enterprise between the British Academy and Emma's UCML. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And Susanna, would you like a last few words then?
Yes, last few words. Well, last year, even though it was a very bad year in many ways for many people, the companies that I work with in Cambridge still managed to export sales of 241 million. And when I've asked most of them, as I do on a fairly regular basis, do you have linguists in the company? They say, well, they don't care where you get your language ability from when you're working for them. If you don't have it, they will buy it in from somebody else. So my plea is, and to give hope that all language learners and their teachers, when you're in your interviews, pipe up and say, as Emma said, the benefits of learning a language, that you have resilience, that you have empathy with your customers, maybe cultural awareness. And I think that you will be able to give, even with a not a completely fluent level of language, you will be able to give the others a bit of a run for their money.
Thank you very much. Thomas, a couple of minutes from you.
So just three very brief iterated things. So firstly, I noticed that Wendy Bennett is here, and I want to acknowledge the fantastic influence that MATES, I mean the Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals and Transforming Societies project had on my work, on my thinking, and bringing together people from different corners. And it just reminded me, because we had many discussions always with Wendy about the kind of preaching to the choir. And you could say that, you know, today the event was a little bit of preaching to the choir. But I think it's extremely important. I'm glad we are doing it. We should do more of it, because such events can give us energy, hope, optimism, motivation, all the things we need. It is about, so to say, keeping the troop morale, and beyond that, they can give us new insights. And that's, by the way, why I kind of put the link to Twitter. I mean, I became a fan of Twitter not because of the opinions that we express, because it's very good to send links to papers, to blogs, and so on and so on. So I think, let us communicate. We need more events like this. I think preaching to the choir is really important.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think we've just got 2 or 3 minutes left till we get cut off, apparently. So, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks. So very briefly, so great conversation. Really interesting to hear all these debates. The message for me is let's think broad and not narrow. Cultural value, not sort of instrumentalist, technical academic as the core. I think this debate about skills and competence-based testing, so as an alternative, you know, more like the CSE than the GCSE, as it were, would be really valuable at all levels. I think the need to promote the wider infrastructure to facilitate exchanges and immersion in both directions. We've talked about the hindrances of the regulatory environment, but also barriers including funding, policy, and immigration controls that limit both the exchange of students and teachers and others who support learning. As to the role of universities, I think alongside their own excellent academic research around languages for those studying languages, it would be great if they can do broader work to look at the value of multilingualism and bilingualism and language acquisition for others, and to support those not studying a particular language as an academic subject, but those who want more generally to acquire language skills for communication in other subjects.
Thank you all very much indeed. That's been, we're about to be unceremoniously cut off, but thank you to all of our speakers, our panelists, for some very, very wise words. And thank you to all of you who put things into the chat. Philip, do you want to have a last word on this, or Tonia? No, I'll go to Tonia.
Yes, just a big thank you to everybody, all our panelists and everybody that's joined this afternoon. And we will keep in touch. So thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
We will indeed. And thank you to Philip, who's been masterminding it behind the scenes for this. Thank you very much. Okay. Anyway, goodbye, everybody. And I'm sure we haven't heard the last of all these wonderful discussions. Right. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.